Good evening, everyone, and thank you for coming. It is 5 o'clock, and we will get started momentarily. I will give folks a minute to come in, but I don't want to take up too much of your time. There's an exciting action-packed select board meeting at 6 o'clock. I want to make sure that we all get to that and have some time to discuss the basics of municipal budgeting and what happens next. So we'll give folks another minute to come in, and we'll start at 5:02 and move on through. Thank you all for coming, by the way. This is a really great opportunity to talk about the budgeting process more generally, go into some of the specifics, and hopefully have a little fun with the education process of it. So let's get started in 30 or so seconds as people continue to come in. All right. Thank you very much. Let's take it away. So thank you all for coming this evening to this Brookline Budget Forum. This is a continuation of an excellent opportunity that Mel Kleckner started a couple of years ago to just kind of provide an overview, a Budget 101 overview of how we build out the budget for Brookline's fiscal year. What the process is by which that budget is created, modified, and approved, what factors impact that budget, and how the town prioritizes how it wants to spend its limited resources. So with that in mind, we hope to kind of take it away here. And I want to just thank, I'm joined by Melissa Goff, our Deputy Town Administrator, as well as Charlie Young, who is our Assistant Town Administrator for Finance. And Charlie is running the slides, so thank you, Charlie. I want to give a brief overview to begin with of municipal finance in 90 seconds. When we talk about municipal finance, what we're talking about is this blanket term. Everything that goes on, right? Our planning, our budgeting, our accounting, everything that relates to our financial resources is municipal finance. Now, the budget, in capital with capital B, is a legal document. It's the thing that appropriates funding for all of our operations and for all of our obligations, like debt we've incurred. And that's true for the town, and it's true for the public schools of Brookline. We refer to PSB here. We'll get into a little more detail about how the schools differ from municipal operations a little bit later on in this presentation. But for now, it's important to note that what we're primarily going to focus on is municipal operations as it relates to the budget, but we will have a discussion of how the schools play into that. Now, one of the biggest aspects of the broader municipal finance process that we follow is something called the capital improvement plan. It is outside of the budget or in parallel to the budget generally, because it is a 6-year plan here that the town develops for when it will make capital expenditures. Now, capital expenditures being, we build a new building, we renovate a playground, things like that. And the other thing that is important about this capital improvement plan is how are we going to pay for these capital improvements? Are we going to finance it with debt? Can we pay cash? Is there cash available? If it is debt, are we going to shoulder the debt as part of our municipal budget, or are we going to ask voters to take on that debt, which is called a debt exclusion, which you may be familiar with just in voting or reading ballot questions. But that's what a debt exclusion is, right? The ability to pay for a capital project with debt financing that is underwritten or supported by the voters and the taxpayers through a temporary property tax increase. So for this capital improvement plan, which has a long-term horizon, the first year of it becomes part of that annual budget in the fiscal year, because that's where we say, okay, year one of this year's CIP is what we're doing in terms of capital projects. So when you hear, as you will often hear, I think in the coming budget season, the CIP is tight. What that means is Although there are projects that the town has identified that we need to deal with, we may not have on hand easy financing for large scale projects like that. So when you hear that shorthand, what it means is there are capital projects that we would like to put in there, but right now we are pushing them out to periods where we think we might have more flexibility to finance them. And lastly, so the financial plan is the overarching document that incorporates the town and PSB sides of the budget, the CIP, county assessments, and various other funds and budgets that we rely on, the enterprise funds, revolving funds, and so forth. Our budget timeline begins way back in fall, in early fall. In fact, when I came onto this job in September, was conveniently the start of budget season in earnest. Our fiscal years run from July to June, July 1st to June 30th. So by the time we get a budget approved and the fiscal year begins in July, it's almost time to start anew, to looking into the next fiscal year. In September, the CIP requests are due. We need to know what departments are looking for and how far out the horizon is. Is this something we need to be thinking about in a 5-year framework, or is this something that we need to start thinking about now? Oftentimes there are no surprises on that front because we are obviously looking at CIP from a 6-year plan, and we are hoping that as the fiscal years advance, the CIP years get closer and closer to year one. But because of the realities of finance, that's not always possible. And of course, there are always unexpected expenditures that we need to factor in. Capital projects that may come due sooner than we've expected, or we may have opportunities. For example, there may be a grant that requires a matching fund, and maybe we try and finance that out of CIP money. So the operating budgets for the departments are due in October. Now that means, what do you need to run your department on a regular basis, on a day in, day out basis? What are your costs of operation? What are your equipment costs? What are your supply costs? All of those things are due as early as October. And then in October and November, we have the budget review meetings. What this is it's a chance for departments to talk through how the last year went, where they see increases in costs, and where they see the possibility for new expenditures. This is a collaborative process with department heads. Individual department heads come in, they speak with Melissa, Charlie, Lincoln Hyman, who is our finance director, and me, and think through how they are going to prioritize their asks given limited finances available to us, and kind of allow us to kind of question the assumptions of how things have grown and what the necessity for the various asks are. As I think all of you know, and has been pointed out, or maybe you all don't know, I apologize, but it's been pointed out a number of times, one of the biggest drivers of cost for us is salaries and benefits. And so a significant portion of a department's budget is always going to be taken up by that number. And then the remainder, the limited remainder of that is going to, it has to make do for many other things. So our department heads do excellent work thinking through how to make the most out of the limited circumstances they often find themselves in at the start of budget season. So the budget summit, which happened this year in December with the select board, is an opportunity for the select board to review the priorities of the town and the fiscal health, and to tell me and the team here what the town's priorities, broad brush priorities should be. Given two options, should we focus on A or B? This year, one of the two big priorities we heard from the select board were transportation and complete streets, kind of an overarching desire to see more money spent on not just the repair and upkeep of the roads, but making our entire road and transit system better, and making our operations and salaries competitive, making Brookline's salaries at the non-union level and collective bargaining ability as high as it can be. And so we've taken those into consideration in evaluating this budget. We also present the forecast to the select board at this point, which is an indication of where we think our fiscal year 24 numbers are going to be, and a preliminary presentation of the CIP. for reasons you'll see, that the CIP presentation was very rudimentary this year, only because one of the big drivers of CIP is a amount we call free cash, which, as Melissa will tell you, is neither cash nor free in reality. But it is an amount that feeds into the CIP and in turn lets us know how much we have on hand for those capital projects, potential capital projects at the start of the budget season. But because due to various issues, the free cash number was not known to certainty until later this budget season. That's why if you go back and watch the Budget Summit presentation from December, there's not as much discussion of the CIP. Now, on February 15th, which is coming up, or in this instance, because we have a new governor, it will likely be 7 days after the governor's budget comes out. My office must submit the financial plan, which is what we talked about on the last slide. It is all that information compiled together about the priorities and the overall, the overall town goals and the town's budget, as long with the school budget. That must be submitted. That's required by statute. And so we are currently over here working long hours to make sure that we meet that deadline whenever the governor's budget may come out. We also rely heavily, as you'll see, on certain elements of state aid. And because this is a new administration, we don't have those numbers yet. And so that's another reason why our process is going to be slightly truncated this year. So once that financial plan is out there, the advisory committee reviews it. Now, you may ask, who is the advisory committee? We can get into a little more detail there. Our advisory committee, suffice it to say, is a subset of town meeting members who have statutory authority to conduct review of the budget. And it is their reviewed version of the budget that is ultimately presented to town meeting for approval. And then in May and June is town meeting. Oftentimes, there's an entire day or more dedicated to the budget in town meetings. So for those of you who went through your first budget process last year as town meeting members, for those of you who are thinking about town meeting, you should know that that's the big blockbuster event of the season. We've covered through this. The budget's legally required process. It's got to be balanced. That's very important because it is we cannot carry a deficit. And now I have been told it is time for Who Wants to Be a Brookline Budget Expert? And with me now is our very own Meredith Rivera, Melissa Goff.
So we decided to throw a little wrench in the presentation this year, Chaz, given that you're new and learning a lot. We decided to give you a quiz, but in the format of Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, you will have lifelines, you will have phone a friends, you will have options. Our first question here is, this is the required finance committee under Massachusetts law. The committee is independently appointed by the town moderator and is charged with evaluating and making recommendations directly to town meeting on the budget and all other proposed financial appropriations. The committee's recommendations form the budget motion to be acted upon by town meeting.
Wait a minute.
Please tell us which answer you think is correct.
I'm going to go with D, final answer.
You are correct. It is the advisory committee. So we'll talk a little bit more about that in the next slides that follow.
Yes. I made $100. I've been told these questions get harder. A brief overview of the budget process and players, right? My job is, it's vested in what's called the Town Administrator Act, which is the home rule document that's passed by the state legislature that dictates my authority vis-a-vis the select board's authority. And that's where that deadline comes from. So the advisory committee, right, as we just said, that committee is independently appointed by the town moderator. There are up to 30 members on that committee. And you will see as part of this process that the advisory committee takes its work very seriously. There's a real diligent effort that goes on between February and May before this reaches town meeting, in which the advisory committee really evaluates the assumptions and the needs of each individual department to determine that this is the best possible budget to submit to town meeting. And then when it reaches town meeting, which is our legislative body, they have the opportunity to conduct that up or down vote on the budget. The town meeting is also allowed to issue debt. They have to approve the issuance of debt and the acquisition of disposal of property, as well as the passage of our local bylaws. Now, the school committee, you have not heard as part of this process yet. The school committee is an independent body, an independently elected body in town. They are the ultimate political overseers of the schools, the public schools of Brookline, and they have what's called bottom line budget authority over their budget, which is to say they are entitled to say, this is the number that we want. And, as part of that process, we evaluate that and it's presented to town meeting. The number as part of the overall budget process is presented to town meeting for approval. But what can't be done is that the schools, there is no line item veto of a school budget. There is no directing the schools to strip out money or add money or whatever. The schools are allowed to say, the only thing that town meeting is allowed to say in terms of what the school's budget is, operating budget is this is your number, not, and here's how you get to spend it. So other important players, the select board, it's the chief executive of the town. They set the policy direction to me in telling me how to build the budget. And they evaluate that budget as it's proposed. They meet independently with departments along with the advisory committee. It's a more general review, but again, it's about that agenda setting. It's about, are we meeting the elected's agenda for the town of Brookline? So we talked a bit about the school committee, and we have bottom line budget authority, right? Ultimately, the town meeting can say, this is your number, school committee, but we can't say to the school committee, this is what you do with it. And the town school partnership. This was back in the 1990s, a very innovative solution, because prior to this, in many communities, not just Brookline, this bottom line authority set up a real conflict between schools and municipal administration, because everyone is fighting for the same pot of resources. And what that would often lead to is a floor fight at town meeting, where school committee members would say, we need more money, and the town would say, we need more money. And it would just get ugly. To avoid that, many town administrators ago and many school superintendents ago, Brookline came up with this novel idea, the town school partnership. It is effectively a diplomatic way to discuss the issues about the split in our operating budgets and who gets what before it comes to town meeting. And it provides a level of certainty relatively early in the budget process. So that's that question about who gets what is the central question that is often asked at the town school partnership. We have a town school partnership meeting upcoming in February. If you were interested in seeing how that process operates, it is a public meeting. I strongly encourage you to attend. Here's a snapshot of last year's budget. This is, you can see, where our money comes from, overwhelmingly property tax. And you can see overwhelmingly where it goes to. When you see this huge pie slot chart, slice of the pie for non-departmental, what you're seeing are things like benefits, $75 million in benefits. Our debt service, we're paying $36 million in debt servicing, which is high. And money that goes into our reserve fund, our rainy day fund for true emergencies. That's where all that non-departmental goes. You could see, can we just go back a slide? Sorry, Charlie, sorry. I want to make one point. You can see here on the increases, right? In 2023, the revenue increase was 4.6%. The expenditure increase was 6.0%. Now, for those of you, in the basics of finance, when your expenditures exceed your revenues, so your percentage of expenditures exceed your percentage of revenues, that means you're going to have to do some creative work to figure out how to close those gaps. So let's talk about where revenue comes from. So property tax, as we said, makes up almost 3/4 of the town's revenue, or at least it did in FY23. Now, we are, as I talk about often at select board meetings and elsewhere, we're governed by the limitations of a law that passed in Massachusetts in the early 80s, ballot initiative which is nicknamed Proposition 2.5. And it's nicknamed that because after the passage of that, the assessed or the amount of property tax on resident in any municipality could not increase by more than 2.5% annually, plus the complex formula for new growth within the community. That is, if there have been new developments, whether commercial, residential, et cetera, new revenues coming into the community, that can be factored in to raise the limit above 2.5%. But in practice, it doesn't raise it that much. and it definitely doesn't raise it in communities where there is no new growth, where for whatever reason, for example, residential development is stagnant or commercial development is stagnant. So it can oftentimes put municipalities into kind of a revenue spiral, where if there's insufficient growth to meet demand, then the municipality looks less attractive to individuals looking for a robust municipality to move into. So we have to be very cautious when it comes to monitoring our new growth. Other ways to increase our revenues include going to the voters. We talked a little bit about debt exclusions, which are temporary increases in property tax for specific purposes. Operating overrides are permanent increases in property taxes. And while when they are put on the ballot, they are for specific purposes for the term that increase in tax levy is set out. So if the municipality says we're going to increase the town's property taxes by $5 million, and we're going to do the following things over a 3-year period, that's the commitment that's made. And then that money is available for more general appropriation. But oftentimes, and we can see that's currently playing out in Newton, where there is several overrides on the ballot, and a couple of debt exclusions, I believe, in March. There is that commitment to ongoing things that are of an ongoing need, like road maintenance. So it's unlikely, even in the aftermath of it being reallocated to the general fund, that it's going to be moved for alternate purposes. One new and exciting aspect of revenue in Brookline is the Community Preservation Act. Brookline recently passed a law that allowed us to add a 1% surcharge to your property taxes, and that is now available for distribution by a Community Preservation Act committee, whose work is going to begin in the fall. There are specific elements of that act, specific restrictions on how that money can be spent. For example, can be spent on recreational matters, parks matters, matters relating to the broader community framework. But that money is meted out by a specific committee for that purpose. And I'm really looking forward to seeing the creative ways that process will go forward. Oh boy, another one of these.
Time for another question. So we talked a little bit about revenue, and Prop 2.5 is definitely a complicated subject matter. So this question is, which of the following does not increase the town's property tax levy?
Can I phone a friend?
Sure. Who would you like to call?
I see in the chat we have mystery guest. Can I call mystery guest?
Sure. Mystery guest, please reveal yourself.
Mystery guest is here. Good evening.
Oh, it's our finance director, Lincoln Heineman. How fortuitous that you are our mystery guest. Can you tell me the answer to this question, please?
Sure. Well, I think, as you mentioned, Proposition 2.5 allows for the 2.5% increase. So I think I know this. In addition to new growth, and the override and the debt exclusion allows the increase just for a particular item. So I think all those A, C, and D are all increases to the property tax levy. So I think it must be B for an underride, for a decrease in the property tax levy.
That would be correct.
Thank you, Lincoln. You saved my bacon.
Looking forward to sharing the winnings.
I don't know if that's like $1,000 level question. Some of the other revenues that we receive are local receipts, which make up 7.3% of FY23. That includes things like your motor vehicle excise tax, cannabis sales tax, hotel, motel, and meals, building permits, other licenses and permits, your common victualler license and so forth, as well as our investment income, which is fairly limited but does exist. We do get money, and not an insignificant amount of money from the state. State aid is meted out to us as part of what's called the cherry sheet, and you can have so there are multiple different kind of subsets of this. One is Chapter 70, which is a specific per pupil allotment of of money towards schools. The other is unrestricted general government aid, which has the funny acronym of UGA, and that's really how they pronounce it. They don't go UGGA. It's actually UGA. I don't know either. So, and then there are, other reimbursement programs and so forth. Now, the differentiation between this estate aid and other federal and state grants, for example, what we get out of Title I, what we get as part of the Community Development Block Grant, something called the State Circuit Breaker Fund, and the one-time funding of pandemic aid, which is most notable in the American Rescue Plan Act. We call those off-budget items. That is to say, we don't factor them into the budget. We don't make we don't view those as revenue per se because of the limitations on how they can be spent, and in many cases of their one-time nature. They just are things that we utilize to off budget address certain aspects of things. And you'll see at the select board meeting tonight, I am actually presenting the town's request for ARPA money for round 2, which is about a $5 million request. And I hope to hear from the broader community and from the select board about the priorities on that list. Free cash. Free cash is the state term used for the end of year fund balance. That is what money we have not spent from what we said we were going to spend is free cash. But we have a town policy for what happens with that money. So it is not really free or cash because it goes into the free cash waterfall, going first into to make sure that we have enough money in the operating reserve and the unfunded, the stabilization fund, the liability and catastrophes fund. Then a portion of it goes into the CIP. This is again why we talked about why it was the CIP wasn't as detailed as it was previously, because this free cash number has a significant impact on it. And then Melissa, this is where you're going to have to help me. AHTF, that's the one I don't know.
That's the Affordable Housing Trust Fund.
Thank you. Which was almost full to almost to the point where we need it to be. Correct.
If it's below $5 million, the policy requires an infusion into the fund.
That's right. Thank you. And then we have the special use, which is, the kind of catch-all. If there is money left over after all of those things from the waterfall, which rarely the case, we do have the opportunity to spend that money in certain special use cases as identified in the waterfall policy. We do have support from other governmental enterprise funds. There's the Cemetery Trust Fund that supports expenses of the cemetery with an annual transfer. There's a revolving fund in the Recreation Department, that is replenished on a regular basis with revenue there. Money in, money out, so it's a revolving fund. And that revenue is not touched as part of the broader budget. It is contributed to as part of that independent fund.
Time for another question. I remind you that you've already used your phone a friend lifeline, but you do have others available to you.
Okay.
So this question is, which of these is not a revenue source for the town?
I'd like to use my 50-50 lifeline, please.
Okay, Charlie, you can use the 50-50, please. Okay, you can see A and B are now off the table, so you have the choice between non-appropriated and local receipts.
Oh, boy. Well, I know we talked about local receipts because those are things like car excise taxes and marijuana taxes. So I think local receipts are a source of revenue funding for the town. So I'm going to go with non-appropriated. We don't treat that as revenue.
Yes, that's correct. Non-appropriated is actually an expense item in our budget. It's actually an item that we don't have control over. These are things like our county assessment, our MBTA assessment. These are charges coming from the state government. Let's
talk about those. Let's talk about our expenses in general, actually, and then we'll move on. So expenses and expenditures. So the school department's budget is the full school department budget, right? All costs, allocated shares of expenses that are funded in other budgets, like healthcare, unemployment, pensions, and so forth. It also includes the school department's reserve for collective bargaining and other wage increases. Now, there are detailed accounts that are created for these individual elements of the school department for budget control. But again, the school committee retains that bottom line authority. Town meeting sets the bottom line, and the school committee decides how to spend it.
I see we have a raised hand. I think we are going to hold off on questions till we get to the end, if anybody has any.
I saw Melissa raises her hand.
Nope, I'm sorry that I didn't mean to do that. Keep going.
Okay. The expenditures in town departments. So this is where, this is where the bread and butter of municipal expenditures come in: DPW, police, fire, library. Then they're appropriated in separate categories. And those categories include personnel, services, supplies, and capital equipment. We do have a reserve in the expenditures for collective bargaining and other wage increases. And I will say that at times, right, one of the things that one of the ways that we balance shortfalls in the municipal budget is by looking at that initial reserve. And so it can be difficult in situations involving that process to think about how much do you need to hold in reserve, or just how much do you have to spend now in order to cover an operating shortfall. So the non-departmental expenditures include primarily benefits, health insurance and pensions, and OPEB, other post-employment benefits. They also include the operating reserve fund, debt. You saw what a significant portion of debt we carry as part of this non-departmental expenditure, and any sort of special funds. Now, special appropriations, this is capital projects. So the CIP is funded through this combination of direct appropriations, that's just cash projects, things that come through free cash, things that we have available to us, and the issuance of debt. We can issue debt as a municipality and take that on with the approval of town meeting. We can borrow money, but it's not excluded debt, right? We carry that on our books, and we are required to find the means to pay both the principal and the interest down. So the town does have a significant amount, but of what's called unexcluded debt that it pays down on a yearly basis. Now, these non-appropriated expenditures that we talked about earlier, these are mandated expenditures and assessments. We don't get to appropriate these. We don't control these. The MBTA, for example, charges us this. Norfolk County charges us about $1 million a year. This is why you hear people often say, why are we still in Norfolk County? We don't even border anyone else in Norfolk County. Norfolk County takes our money. Must we be in Norfolk County? There are a lot of conversations about that. But I will say that since Norfolk County also holds a lot of our ARPA money, we're very friendly with Norfolk County right now. Another question, oh boy.
Okay, so we talked earlier in the presentation about free cash, and we had the waterfall. What is not a component of the town's free cash policy? The building department budget, the capital improvement plan, the reserve fund, or the liability fund?
I don't know if this is in the Town Administrator Act, but I feel compelled to cheat and use another phone a friend. Is it possible that I could ask Charlie to answer this?
Sure, that'd be great.
Hey, Chaz, I'm happy to jump in on this. So I remember the free cash policy talked about the waterfall and the sort of list of priorities of different items. I don't remember seeing budgets in there. I remember the capital improvement plan, and we have to put some amount into the reserve fund if it falls too low. Same thing with our liability and catastrophe funds. I think it has to be the budget. I'd love if we had some policy where we were always putting something towards building maintenance, but I don't think that's something that's mandated.
That's correct. That is not a component of the free cash policy. Thanks, Charlie.
Thank you, Charlie. So we talked about the town school partnership, and the primary purpose of the town school partnership is to set this town school split. Now we have the initial kind of revenue that comes in. We have what are called non-departmental fixed costs, or you often refer to these as above the line costs, right? Costs that for whatever reason are directly allocated from revenue rather than going through this split and then appearing on either the town or the school's budget. So it's a significant amount of revenue, but it still leaves more than $2 million to go through the split. There are also allocated costs for services, right? For example, for utilities and payroll and IT and purchasing, things that the departments handle certain aspects of, that the town and school handle certain aspects of jointly, and so those costs are allocated out prior to looking through the split. And then the town's budget and the school's budget are determined based on the formula developed at the town school partnership. The current town school partnership formula was set, and the method of setting it it dates back several years now. I believe the most recent evaluation of the model came in, I believe, 2008. And then subsequently, there have been minor tweaks to that formula based on conditions that we see on the ground. It involves things like enrollment, operating costs, all of those things. Excuse me. And we have in the previous months discussed the possibility of reevaluating that split more holistically, rather than just saying, we'll plug the regular numbers in and see what result we get and tweak it as necessary. We both on the town and school side, I think we've acknowledged that there's a benefit to the community in reassessing how the town school split works. And so the superintendent and I know, are committed to engaging in this process as we continue our work together. So this is a kind of initial outlook for fiscal year 2024. And I will say that this number at this point, because of the uncertainties that we have in things like state aid, free cash was just recently certified, but we still don't know about things like state aid. We're still concerned about certain expenditures with benefits that are not 100% certain. So this number changes on a regular basis until we are ready to go with presenting the fiscal plan. So yesterday our deficit was not $679,000, but today that's what we're projecting. Yesterday the school deficit was not 7.5, but that is what we're projecting. So what does it mean to project a deficit? As I said at the beginning of this, we cannot operate under a deficit. We must present a balanced budget to the state for approval. The state will not let us deficit spend under the assumption that we'll make it up somewhere. So we must present a budget that zeroes out for town meeting's approval. And as a practical matter, that means that there can be cuts to our operating budgets. That we look at areas where we might be able to, if revenue exceeds expectations, add services in the fall, but we cannot, under the law, finance them. Say that we're going to deficit spend to finance them. I think a lot of people are concerned sometimes when they look at the budget process and they say, well, aren't you being too conservative in how much money you think you're going to get from the state? Don't you think your revenues look a little low? Don't you think that that maybe this year will be better than last year, and that you can maybe budget a little more generously and have more money in the budget to spend on things that we want to spend on? And what I'll say there is, I think COVID really demonstrated to people the importance of being very prudent in the initial analysis of what our projected revenues are going to look like. We really have to be clear with the community that rosy projections in order to then create expenditures can lead to the opposite of what we want to happen in the fall, which is unfunded liabilities. The last position that we want town meeting to be in at a special town meeting in the fall is confronting a deficit they have to fill somehow. We would much rather be in the position of balancing out, not an unexpected windfall, but a modest excess of either unexpended resources or the ability to rebalance things that were cut in the spring. One way to address these structural deficits is through operating overrides. Some communities do operating overrides regularly, and they view it as the cost of doing business, right? That communities say, we understand that our growth exceeds, that our growth of services and our need for services exceeds our growth, that is, and new growth and Prop 2.5 cap. And so we rely on the voters on a regular basis to make up the difference. Brookline has not historically been a community like that. We rely on operating overrides on an as-needed basis. But I think one of the most important things that we've had long-term conversations on with the select board this year is the reality of that gap we talked about earlier, how expenditures are regularly exceeding revenues in Brookline, and that gap will continue to grow. And so while an operating override is a possibility this year in order to finance certain aspects of town operations that are a priority for the community, I also think it's important to note that that operating override in the select board's mind and in our mind is being viewed as much as possible as an investment in smart growth, a growth that allows us to meet our expenditure needs. Ultimately, what we want to spend on are things that result in a positive return on investment. And so one of the initial priorities, just to give an example, right? We talked about a possible operating override in December. And one of the priorities mentioned in that operating override was expanding the capacity of the planning department. Why would we expand the capacity of the planning department? Because if they can reevaluate certain areas for smart, sustainable commercial growth, commercial tax revenue is a significant source of funds in other communities that Brookline doesn't have. So if we invest that money now in planning with the hope of increasing a more diversified tax base, we're actually having a positive return on that investment. So those are the kinds of aspects, those are the kinds of things that we're looking to think about as we consider if the community believes it needs additional funding to cover its expenditures, how do we structure that in such a way that creates as much as possible a positive return on investment and a close in that gap going forward? Another one. This
will be your final question. We like acronyms here in municipal government. So ARPA, CIP, what does CIP actually stand for?
All right, I have reserved this for the last one. Can I ask the audience, please?
Sure. We're going to try and see if our polling function works so that everyone who's an attendee can try and answer this question, if Charlie can enable the poll.
All right, I'm going to go ahead and launch the poll now. So you'll see it come up on your screen with the four options. Choose the one you think is right. I will give everyone, we'll say 30 seconds to submit.
I asked, by the way, if we could do the Who Wants to Be a Millionaire sound cues, and we can't. So I'm going to complain to Zoom government.
Ten more seconds. Still have a few people who could participate if they wanted to. Okay, it's been up for 30, so let's see what the audience thought. 98% say capital improvement plan, Chaz. That is about as skewed as it can get.
Well, I very much appreciate that. And to the one of you who said cash inspection procedure, that's okay. We're all friends here. And I'm hoping that was a municipal employee who was pulling my leg. I really appreciate, again, the opportunity to kind of walk through this initial budget process with you. And what I want to say is this is the start of the conversation, far from it being the end. I look forward to engaging at select board meetings, at the advisory committee. I know oftentimes the League of Women Voters in town also conducts a kind of budget forum, and as they previously did with Mel. I'm really looking forward to that. And I'm looking forward to hearing from you about your budget priorities and your thoughts as we go forward on this. I will say that in this period of budget deficit, structural deficit, it is difficult for us to think about how we prioritize when what we were looking at least in a world without an operating override or an unexpected source of revenue elsewhere, as cuts. But I think that's all the more reason for us to hear from you about what it is that the community values and how we can continue to serve you, the residents of Brookline.
Okay, we have a number of questions here. Some have already been answered. I'm not sure if we want to read those aloud. I think if you have a question if you have your hand raised and you have a question, it'd be great actually if you could submit into Q&A. We only have about 15 minutes before select board. We had a question on how does the town pay for collective bargaining increases if the reserve doesn't cover the increase? We're talking about the collective bargaining reserve earlier. Melissa answered that one and said we would have to make reductions in other areas of the budget. We had another question about the delay it took to get our free cash certified this year. We've had a lot of turnover at the highest level here. We had significant turnover throughout the finance department, including the finance director themselves and my position as well. And we have a few others here. Can we anticipate that the town school formula will return to 50-50? Chaz, I will let you take that one.
So I don't necessarily think it's going to be 50-50 in the near term, but what I will say is that I think rather than tracking an old formula, it should track a more equitable split. I think it should evaluate what the actual needs of on a per pupil basis on the school side and on the municipal level of the town side. So I think it will be closer to 50-50. But I'm also, this is something that I say often, right? That although we are competing for the same resources, I really, the town values the schools as a major driver of interest in Brookline, right? People want to live in Brookline because of the reputation of the Brookline School Department. And that is a synergistic relationship. And so we want the schools to be healthy. We want the schools to have what they need to succeed. But we also want them to be good stewards of our money. So we have to balance those two competing interests out.
Jocelyn and Christine, please go ahead and if you have a question, please submit it into Q&A. We're going to try to get through these because we have to jump to select board. Another question says, Brookline is one of the last municipalities to have a health premium share benefit over 70%. I believe it is 83%, they say.
That's right.
How have other towns brought down their benefit share, and has there been any attempt to discuss renegotiating in order to help with the structural gap?
Other towns have brought down their benefit share through, primarily through collective bargaining. Again, while I'm loath to discuss, the details of collective bargaining, has there been any attempt to discuss renegotiating that share? Yes. I continue to be open to that. I continue to discuss, I welcome discussion with our unions about what the appropriate balance of that is. I know that some organizations are more enthusiastic about that than others, but I would encourage all of us to come to the table together. I believe our next meeting is in March to discuss what the right share of health premium should be.
Okay, barring a couple more questions from two folks who have their hands raised, Jocelyn and Christine, if you have questions, please submit them in Q&A. We do have one final question here that could be, here we go. Actually, I'll leave that one for last. We have another one that says, in FY 2020, the collective bargaining reserve had a budgeted amount and an actual amount that were different. Why was the actual amount so much lower than budgeted amounts? I think, Melissa, probably you're the best person to answer this, but the short answer is that it has to do with moving that money in, rather than spending it directly from that account. The actual wouldn't necessarily be reflective of how it was spent. It would go into a department's budget after a collective bargaining agreement was settled.
That's correct. Once the agreements are voted by town meeting, they get transferred into departmental budgets.
So the actual and budget lines aren't going to be accurate necessarily for, well, the budget will be, but the actual will not necessarily be for the collective bargaining reserve. It's a good question. All right. It looks like Jocelyn is all set with her question. We have one other question here that says, where can we see the recording of this presentation? I believe it will be posted on YouTube.
We posted on Big's website. Thank you to Big for recording this tonight. Really appreciate it.
The town administrator's website will also have the recordings, as the past recordings are also on the town administrator's website.
And like I said, this is the beginning of this budget conversation. This is the bare bones basics that we hope to give you to have a sense of what's coming next. I welcome your questions and comments as we proceed through this. This is an exciting time in Brookline. This is a time where we really are thinking about our priorities in a time of scarcity, but also in a time of change. And so I am excited to work together with you to make the best budget possible for this community that reflects your values. And I am, as I said, I look forward to hearing from you as this process continues. So thank you for your time today. Thank you for the 50 attendees who came. I'm really grateful. And now I hope you will join us at 6 o'clock for the hybrid select board meeting, either here in person at Town Hall or on Big or by using Zoom. Please get yourself some dinner and settle in. It's going to be a really interesting meeting. Thank you for taking the time.